Right, guys, welcome to the Functional Health Podcast. This is episode 1 with Austin Stout. If you know anything about functional health, Austin Stout is probably one of the first people that you would think of. Austin, do you want to just introduce yourself to people that maybe not know you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been working in this functional health quote unquote space for, oh man, I don't know. I guess since the beginning in some way, shape, or form. It's kind of evolved over time. I've been coaching for about close to 16 years now. Um, these ideas and theories around things like GI health and blood work analysis and all this stuff for athletes and competitors and fitness enthusiasts really came around, I would say, pretty heavily around 2012 to 2014. Things started to emerge a little bit more. I had a lot of my own personal issues with hormonal dysregulation from competing too much. That was my lesson that I learned. And, adrenal issues, GI issues kind of went through the gambit. And that's actually what introduced me to these ideas and these theories, right? And then, of course, a lot of that translated over to my clients. And so I saw it was a gap. There was a gap, right? There was a gap in this need that wasn't being met. And what we were on a very basic level, you would look at the response of a client and look like, hey, I take 500 calories away from this person and it works, and from this person it doesn't work. And so what is happening, right? Understanding adaptations. And then that actually bled a little bit more into the bodybuilding space, because when we're in the bodybuilding space, we're eating high amounts of food. There's oxidative stress from, androgen use. There's also going to be, extremes as far as like contest prep deficits, fat loss agents. I mean, there's all these other things that you're actually like adding on top of the daily stressors, life, work, relationships, all this stuff. So we see a lot of gastrointestinal issues in the bodybuilding space, just as much, if not more, than the gen pop space, right?
Yep.
Yeah, especially when you're talking like high amounts of food intake, larger people, like you're running into this stuff a lot. So that's kind of a really convoluted way to describe how I ended up here.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for describing that. Now, I've known you for a wee bit now. I've mentored underneath you in terms of learning what I've learned from the kind of a functional health side of things as well. In terms of obviously me having IBD and a stoma, etc. But where I'm wanting to kind of go today, because I've listened to quite obviously a lot of your podcasts, as I've watched quite a lot of your stuff, but nobody really takes into account of some of the functional side of the training aspect of it. And I think I'd like to segue there. I'd like to have you back on talking more of the GI health and blood work, etc. But I think for this episode, I'd like to concentrate on the kind of a training aspect of it. And what's your kind of a take on if somebody comes to you and they're having kind of a just say gut issues, whether it's like IBD like myself, Crohn's colitis, or other autoimmune, what's your kind of a first thoughts of what you do in terms of training?
Yeah. So I really like this topic, because training, or exercise in general, is one of the very few quantifiable variables that we can control.
Yep.
When someone comes into us, we basically have this situation where there's accumulation of stress somewhere, right? That has created in genetics, and your food intake and your nutrition all play into this as well. But there's always going to be a stress component to some degree. And stress is difficult because a lot of stress is very abstract, right? It's not quantitative. It's measurable in the sense that you can see things on blood work. You can look at things like, biofeedback markers, heart rate, blood glucose, HRV, and you can see that stuff, but it's still not very black and white, right? So training, or you kind of like lump cardio into this as well, just your output, right?
Yep.
That is quantifiable. It's measurable, it's trackable, and it's adjustable very easily. Now, easily on paper, but the problem is that The problem is that most of the people that we're going to be dealing with like training,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So there's an emotional component that comes with it. So just telling someone to not train or telling someone to train less might sound like it's going to be productive, but of course getting them to do that's a little bit different story. But with training being one of the very few things that we can actually adjust quite easily, it tends to be one of the first things that we adjust, right?
Yep.
So I think when we're intaking a new client that has a functional health issue, especially when you're talking something like IBD, which is an inflammatory issue,
Yep.
there's going to be, obviously nutrition is going to be a huge consideration, supplementation, but we're going to look heavily at their total systemic stress load. So that's going to be work, relationships, also psychological tendencies and personality is huge. That's probably one of the biggest components.
Yep.
And then training. Now, there's some very obvious situations. Someone's coming in, they're training 6-7 days a week, they're doing high volume and all that stuff. Like that's a very obvious stress burden, right? Yep. We need to adjust that. But I think that the first thing that we should remember is it's about reduction, not elimination.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't have to be extreme. It's a reduction. It's just like nutrition. With nutrition, we would probably do something like a food log, or what are you already eating? Like, what are your current macros? If they're tracking that stuff already, you wouldn't just go to one extreme end of the spectrum. You would make an adjustment based on what they're already doing, generally speaking. And so training is going to be the same way. If we can do this through a few means. One is volume, how much, right? Intensity is a big one because that's going to affect the nervous system pretty heavily. Then there's also movement selection, and there might be some other small variables, but those three are going to be probably the biggest that we can adjust. And now the goal is to reduce stress, essentially, right? The goal is to reduce total stress load. So the first thing I like to look at is the emotional attachment to the training, because I need to figure out, hopefully I can figure it out fairly easily, but not always, but I need to figure out what is the easiest adjustment. Now, why is that important? Because if I do something that's very abrupt and difficult, now you're creating a psychological stressor. You're replacing the reduction in training with someone that's like pacing around their house, not knowing what to do because they're not in the gym.
Yep.
So now you created a rumination or hyperfixation or stress trying to reduce the stress, and that's obviously counterproductive. Yep. So there's a guy, that big finance guy, and any of the US listeners, maybe some of the international listeners, Dave Ramsey's a big finance guy, talks about like how to get out of debt, right? And I use this analogy, I use this kind of like verbiage that he talks about, which is start with the smallest debts first. Okay. Right. So what are the smallest debts? Well, in this case, the smallest debts are probably the ones that are going to have the least psychological ramification.
Yep.
So what are you least attached to? Right.
Yep.
That's probably the easiest way to get it. And then over time, people kind of they tend to relax. They tend to eventually ease into that mindset. And basically what they're doing is they're relinquishing control.
Yeah.
At some point, hopefully, right? Because you hired a coach, right? You hired a coach to help guide you. So that might mean that we're adjusting volume. It might mean intensity. It might mean movement selection. But what I find is that adjusting intensity and adjusting movement selection is probably easiest across the board. Now, there are caveats to that. If people are like, man, all I like to do is barbell squat and deadlift. It's like, okay, why is movement selection important? Well, to put it quite simply, highly stable movements and movements that require a lot of bracing will have different amounts of fatigue, that you're creating different amounts of fatigue. Okay. Yeah. if you want to train your hamstrings and your glutes and you're doing an RDL, there's a lot of bracing required, right?
Yep.
Okay. But if we train our glutes and hamstrings in perhaps like a glute ham raise or doing a leg curl and then maybe a separate isolated glute movement, these are very stable. They're not, it doesn't require you to get the setup and to brace your core, and you're not, you're not like having to like walk back off the rack if you're doing a squat, like all these things. So there's, and I know that may not seem significant, but it is in these cases, because cumulatively, if you're doing that across the whole entire session with different movement selection, it's going to add up, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So I think the easiest way to think about that is you're kind of switching to like machines, cables, maybe you throw some dumbbell stuff in there, right? But a lot of the multi-joint, I don't even want to say multi-joint, because that's not correct, because a chest press machine is like, that's 2 joints, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the movements that require stabilization are probably going to be the first that I'm going to pull out. Okay.
Yep.
The nice thing about that is I can usually get most people on board with that, because we could like still do close to the same volume.
Yeah.
Right. But you're creating a lot less fatigue. So that's like an easy like segue into the training. And then we would probably remove a lot of, intensity techniques and things like that if we can, like drop sets, partials, if you're doing like lengthened partials, if you're doing, maybe if you're doing like any type of supersets, that those might be viable. That's a little bit different. Yeah, I mean, basically any intensity technique that's going to generate more fatigue at the end of a set. So the idea would be to probably stop most sets a little bit short of failure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I like that as well. I find that, if somebody's stuck on a certain exercise, whether it be kind of what you mentioned there, like bench, squat, deadlift, or that, you tend to find that they do multiple sets of them. So even the point of just reducing it down to one set of that, you tend to be able to keep them on board, and then obviously mirror the rest of the training round about that. I think it's looking at the overall program. And as you said, it's reduction at the end of the day. It's not about removing everything, because if they've got an emotional attachment to a certain exercise and they feel really good in that, I think we need to keep it in there, but we need to control how much of the kind of output of that is. Whether that be that instead of going kind of a balls to the wall and going all in, do we leave 1 or 2 reps in reserve, so to speak, as well?
Yeah, and so you can define some of these terms. I know it's kind of a training podcast, but it's also kind of a functional health podcast. But I think it's important to kind of define the terms, because the reality is most people that end up deep into these situations have a tendency to do too much.
Yeah.
It's just how it is, right?
Yep.
Like there's more of everything is better until it's not,
Yep,
like
totally
more
agree.
And we have science like that. The literature backs that up. It's like more volume is better until you can't recover from it, right?
Yep.
More supplement, more hormones are better until the side effects are outweighing.
Keeping up.
There's always a kind of this point of diminishing return, and that's why I said earlier personality is so big with this. So I think defining this term of like, well, what is failure? I like to use, especially for this crowd or people that have a tendency to do this, and I'll explain what I mean. Like technical failure, meaning if you're doing a set of, let me use a free weight movement, because this would be an easiest way to explain it. If you're doing a barbell squat, then you're basically going to start shifting your mechanics.
Yeah.
When you start to fail, right?
Yep.
That's just how it is. So what's going to happen is if you're doing a quad focused barbell squat, you're probably getting a lot of knee flexion. It's like very vertical, maybe you're using like a shoe or a wedge. I don't know. Kind of depends like what's your ankle mobility, right? So you're doing the squat, you start to fail. What happens? Your butt starts shifting back, right? You start leaning forward. You're using your lumbar, you're turning this. And if you just keep going, you could stand up and take 5 deep breaths and keep doing these until they eventually look like good mornings.
Yeah.
Or something, or like a deadlift. That's an example of that. So what that's doing is you're shifting off of that target muscle and you're creating a ton of additional fatigue. So when you're doing that, I think that it's very important to basically make the sets look the same, identical. All the reps should look identical. You shouldn't be shifting around. You shouldn't do any of that. The last rep will get kind of slow. That's it. That's technical failure. Anyone can stand up and take 5 deep breaths. It's a rest pause.
Yeah.
At that point, like that doesn't necessarily, I guess if that's the goal, then fine. But in this case, probably not the goal, right?
Yeah.
So we can define that as technical failure, and then they know like, okay, that's where I stop the set. And then if we're adding things like RIR, like reps in reserve, now you have a gauge where you can actually gauge your RIR a little bit better, in my opinion. Because I think that there's so much subjectivity when you're talking about things like, measuring intensity and all that. It's like, what does that even mean? There's pain, there's there's rep ranges. If you're training in very high rep ranges, that it gets very blurry because you like actually reaching technical failure on a set of 20 is
sometimes you're gassing out before your muscles failing.
It's kind of a gray area. You can do it for sure. So the other thing would be, and I'm talking about like easy stuff. This is like easy things we can do. The other thing would be rep ranges. I do actually like to kind of keep these rep ranges around maybe 8 to 10. I might throw a 12 or 15 in there, but not as much when you're dealing with these types of issues, because it is going to create more fatigue. Okay. Yeah. So
I prefer the kind of a lower rep ranges myself as well. Depending on the exercise, anywhere between 6 and 12. That's the way I generally go. Same with sets as well. Kind of a 1 to 2. Some isolations maybe go to 3 sets of them, but it's more on the lower end, lower volume. Is what I found very difficult was my switch. Obviously, when I was noticing a lot of issues. I was balls to the wall. As you said, all in. Everything was getting chucked in there. I found it very hard transition to come out of that. So like when people come to me now and you're coaching them, you've been there. Like you've been there yourself as well with your adrenals and stuff like that when you're pushing yourself too hard. And you kind of need to pull yourself back a bit. I just wanted to touch back on the point of a kind of a newbie into training. So I think sometimes people look at it and the issue that you've got is somebody new who's coming into this. So they're coming in with gut issues, but they're new to training and not really experienced in training. And the issue that you've got with them is the total reverse, because they're eager to train and sometimes try to tell them that training's not really the most important thing for them at the moment can be a bit of a trigger. And then that's when the psychological thing comes in, which you were referencing. Do you see that much, or is mostly your demographic all people who's more trainers, if you like?
That's a fair question. I would probably tell you that my demographic is for these types of issues, it's probably like 60 to 75% more serious fitness enthusiasts, competitors, whatever. And then you'll have, 25 to 40%, I guess, would be the difference of varied gen pop. Okay. So I don't run into that as much, but I definitely understand what you're saying. And I do genuinely run into that now. But with those individuals, the interesting thing is that with those individuals, if they're very new, then there's also maybe adherence issues with other parts of the plan because they have less experience. Now, with very experienced individuals and competitors, adherence is not a problem. In fact, too much adherence is probably a problem. It's almost like, the irony is, it's almost like adherence at the expense of your own health sometimes.
Yep.
Right? Because they're going to just do whatever it is they needed, or whatever it is they think they need to do or they're supposed to do. So it's really up to me to program correctly, because if I tell them to, go out and like eat dog poop outside, they're going to do it. Right? If I tell them to do 30 sets of chest, like, they would try.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of ironic that the personality type and the experience plays into it so much, but the solutions become a lot, I don't want to say they become a lot different, because the general principles are the same. It's just the psychology behind it is a lot different, right? I almost find correcting these issues with less experienced people is easier.
Yeah.
Actually, I would probably say it is most of the time. I would say correcting these types of issues, especially when we're talking things that have a heavy immune component like IBD.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I would say it's easier with people that are not extremists.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right in what you're saying there, and I also think it becomes a bit different as well when you start linking the stomas that obviously come with some of the IBD people as well, like myself. I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to training with them, as much as you can use exercises that are more stable for them, there's this sort of a thing in the back of their head about hernias. That's one of the biggest things that's always mentioned about, they're paranoid about getting a kind of a hernia, and I think that's one of the biggest psychological battles that you have with them, and trying to kind of push but pull them back at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have much experience with having to work around like kind of a hernias and stuff?
So the general principles again are similar in that if you're using bracing movements, because most of your hernias are going to be umbilical, or, I mean, you get a hiatal hernia, that's different, that's more internal, but a lot of them will be like umbilical, or maybe somewhere in the pelvic area or lower abdomen or something like that. Really a lot of it is going to be trickier when you're talking lower body movements.
Yep.
Because most of the upper body movements we can pretty easily isolate with very little strain on the abdomen, right, area.
Yep.
You can chest, shoulders, back, biceps, triceps, like that. I feel like you can pretty much work around it. It's the lower body is going to be a little bit harder, because again, you're probably gonna like crunch down if you're doing even on simple things like a leg extension, right? So my general advice there is actually kind of just reframing the rep execution, and just actually, because what tends to happen with most people is they're always thinking like maximum amount of weight I can use for the movement. Actually, well, let's slow down and get better at hitting the target muscle a little bit, reduce that load, reduce the bracing that's required, and that will greatly reduce your chances of having those issues, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so again, it's kind of just a reframing of how you're executing a movement. It's not a reason that to go easy necessarily, but it's slower tempos, better breathing techniques, things like that can make a difference. Actually breathing through the sets. Maybe you might have to be careful with things like leg presses, for example, when you're having like a lot of abdominal movement in those movements. But it's you can work around it.
Yeah, I think it's funny you say about leg press because I mean I know everybody's different, but for myself, for instance, I'll use myself as an example. I actually find leg press far easier on my stoma than, let's say, loading up a kind of a hack squat, because some of the hack squats, like the Cybex one that everybody loves, that kind of kills me when I get to that bottom portion. Whereas I can use the leg press and I don't have any issues at all. Now, obviously, I've not got a hernia, but I've got the stoma there. So there is still some aspect similar to a hernia. I've got to obviously watch when I'm coming down. But again, the breathing and the bracing is kind of everything. That's one of the first things that I kind of teach with stomas. But again, even just in general training, the bracing and the breathing's one of the biggest parts.
Yeah, even with things like overhead movements, if you're doing like a lat pull down or something, anything that's lengthening lengthening the midsection a lot can be a bit of a problem sometimes for people.
Yep.
But again, it all really comes back to how well can you train that target muscle and not anything else around it.
Yeah.
And that's hard for beginners. But the good thing about a beginner is they're probably not using that much weight anyhow.
Yeah,
right?
there is that.
So they probably don't need a lot of load, which with the advanced people, it's a bit more of a retraining process. Like even people that without stoma or hernia issues, I find it interesting, like how much you can accomplish, how much more productive your training can be with learning how to actually train the target muscle better.
Yeah.
So now people listening to that are like, wow, he's probably one of those weird science-based lifters that does like the weird shit. I'm like, I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
But I will say, as I've gotten more advanced in my own bodybuilding, you have to figure out ways to make things more effective. Like you can't like you're never just, especially when you start getting up to I'm not old. I'll be 36 soon, but I have a lot of miles on the car, right? So
Yep.
or kilometers, I guess. But you're not just going to be overloading your dumbbell presses till you die. Like you're not you got to figure out better ways to do it. So even myself, I've found that's been big, and less, knock on wood, less joint issues, things like that. But going back to the training, we kind of talked about movement selection being huge, removal of unnecessary intensity techniques being big, because at this point, a lot of the training is probably more like muscle maintenance, right? You mentioned maybe a volume reduction or like total working sets being a big one.
Yep.
Now, with the volume reduction, that could be, there's a lot of ways to do that, right? Like it depends on how you're counting your sets and all that stuff. But I would tend to, if someone is really, really hell-bent on the intensity piece, then I might be able to get them to buy into the volume reduction.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They're like, well, I want to train really hard. I said, okay, cool. Let's train really hard. Let's do like 2/3 of what you were doing before.
Yeah.
Can we make that compromise? Right. That will work, right? Like essentially at the end of the day, we're kind of ending up in the same point one way or the other. Now, so once we've kind of figured all that out, we've got a pretty good system, and it's just going to be about assessing the check-ins and seeing how they're recovering and so on and so forth. But I will say this, I think there's a big, at least, and I don't know how prevalent this is now, but it definitely was early on. There was a lot of people that were like, you can't train. You just have to stay out of the gym, right? If that's not been my experience with people, to be honest. Like I've helped within the functional space, probably thousands of people at this point, between clients and then all the one-off consultations, and plus all the coaches I've helped with their clients. I don't have thousands of clients, obviously. I'm not going to sit here and make up those egregious numbers, but So 90% of the time, that's just not necessary to completely remove. And this is where we're getting back into the psychological component, because I even with all the things we're doing, even if we're kind of like meeting in the middle, I will tell you that they're probably still not going to be that happy about it.
Yeah.
Not at the beginning, but buy-in to everything increases when you start seeing some positive effects.
Yeah.
Right? Like the minute you start seeing any glimpse of positivity, you're like, ooh, less symptoms today, or I feel a little bit better, or I'm recovering a little better. Now we can get buy-in to the process. Right?
Yep.
Now, that might be a little harder for some people than others, but I think that if anyone's listening and they're really struggling with like relinquishing that, that control, it's like, what I'll tell you is that when it starts working, you will be glad that you did. And that is the catalyst to change. It's really just making that initial breakthrough. And once you make that initial breakthrough, you can make a lot more breakthroughs after that, because you've created buy-in and you immediately have you're kind of like letting your guard down. Because a lot of people, even with all the experience I have, and I get referrals, when I tell them to, do certain things like training less, they might still be a little combative. I don't want to say it's because they don't trust me. I think that maybe that could be it, but I think a lot of it is just, it's fear. Like their fear is that they're going to lose their physique, right? Their fear is that all their muscles going to go away. Their fear is that all of everything that their strength is going to go away. And yeah, I mean, there could temporarily be some fluctuation, but if you just keep doing what you're doing, it's all going away.
Yeah, it's getting worse.
Like, so, I remember with myself, like a little personal anecdote is, I had some issues with what I would consider more of like an IBD cluster of symptoms, right? And I struggled with it, right? I struggled with the training and kind of like making myself do it, but I've never gone back, to be honest with you. I still train very intensely, but currently we're talking about this like total stress load thing. I train 4 days per week. I've made a lot more, and I've adjusted volume, different parts of my, training cycles, but I've never gone back to training 5 or 6 days a week. And that's in large part because I have a lot of other stress.
Yeah.
I mean, just being completely honest, like I don't no reason to sugarcoat that. I have a lot of other stress. Like there's, business and family and all the other stuff. But when I was like, man, this feels weird. I don't really like this, but I started seeing improvements in how I felt. And I actually was getting a little bit stronger doing less. And then I started seeing my physique improve a little bit. I thought, holy shit, this is working. This whole like recovery thing is real.
Yeah.
And this was, of course, many, many, many years ago. But what I find is that people your body's not fragile. It's not fragile. So minor fluctuations day to day and symptom is very normal variability. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. But I think people in the fitness space grossly overestimate their capabilities.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is every person in the fitness space, or most people, still have the same outside stressors that other people outside of the fitness space have. They have jobs, maybe they have families, maybe they have, financial, I don't know, whatever people stress about. So you're telling me that you have all these other things that stress people out, and just because you eat better and maybe try to sleep a little bit better, and not all of them even sleep a little better, that's not even a thing, that you're able to just beat yourself to death and handle it. No, you're not. yes, you've created some adaptation. You can recover skeletal muscle faster, stuff, but like your nervous system is not just going to turn into this like bulletproof, right? Your immune system's not going to just become bulletproof. It's not how that works. So I think that's where it's hard for people to wrap their head around this concept. Like they're like, well, I'm doing everything right. So, dude, but you're still like, you're forgetting all of this other stuff out here that is taking away from your training recovery ability, right?
Yep.
What analogies do people use? The bucket, right? Your bucket's overflowing.
Yep.
I used to use this. Sometimes I'll use it. The pie chart. Remember, the pie chart has percentages as the slice of pie.
Yep.
And if you have a very stressful life outside of the gym that's taking up a pretty large slice of that pie, you have less pie left over for training.
Yep.
That's just how it is. I can't always fix that. And then you add in extreme personalities, and that's where people struggle, because they think they're just really dedicated. And I'm like, no, you're just really neurotic. And this is making you worse, not better.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is kind of what you see in social media that impacts a lot of things. Because again, I think a lot of people don't get the distinction where if you've got autoimmune issues or if you're just a normal able body, they two things are very different. Because if you're prone to the immune issues, then you're always going to have to think about that in the back of your head, because you might have things under control, but if you go too far, you're going to set your immune system back off again, and that's where the difference is. Whereas somebody who's not had to live that sort of life or have the issues, then they're very different, and I think people don't think about the two things.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And it's going to be, I was having that conversation with someone the other day about the reality of the situation. Like the reality is that it's management, not curing anything.
Yeah.
Really. Now you could be in remission for forever, right?
Yep.
That's the goal. But you're probably going to have some issues. You're probably going to mess up.
You're going to have ups and downs. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just about learning from each experience and understanding triggers and what is your capacity, and adjusting that over time, so you're minimizing your mistakes as you go further. Like you can kind of, without being too fixated, that's key.
Yeah.
You can start recognizing things a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
And a suggestion that I like to make to people is that the more that you learn about yourself and your abilities and your recovery and things like that, the more things you need to forget. So what I mean by that is there's a lot of stuff you're going to focus on that you'll find doesn't really do anything for you anymore, or it never did anything for you, like tracking certain variables or certain pieces of blood work or whatever. I've done so many sets of blood work on myself and been through so many shitty situations that I kind of know like what stuff I need to pay attention to and what stuff just doesn't really move the needle much for me.
Yeah.
Right. So all this stuff, I don't worry about it. Right. It doesn't need to take up my space anymore. And so, but at the beginning, you're worried about everything because you're trying to figure out what matters. Right. And even within the training, you're probably like fixated on everything. It's like, oh man, I had a little flare up this week. Was it the fact that I changed from a hack squat to a leg press? Like that's what you're going to be thinking, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that the thing? Probably not. Probably very unlikely, right? It's probably something completely unrelated, but that's kind of something that you really need to learn over time from a programming standpoint. And then you won't have to change stuff very often. You'll kind of figure out like where you function best and where you thrive best, and you can operate there. I love that you said social media. You know what I've noticed on social media is that there was a point where a lot of like the influencer movement started. Everyone was like team no sleep, I'm going to just go hard, like just, whatever. And the hustle culture. And there's still some
Yep.
of that, right?
Yep.
And then people found out that that was causing problems. But it was interesting because we almost went the complete opposite direction and we're like, you're very fragile.
Yeah. Fatigue.
Like it softened too much, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yep.
So what did that do? Well, when it softened too much, what did we do? We took all these people that didn't give a shit about anything and we made them care about a bunch of stuff that didn't really matter.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yep.
so we basically in an attempt to tell people that you needed to sleep and be less stressed, which is basically the whole thing, that we created a bunch of like highly ruminating, hyperfixating individuals and we made things worse. Isn't that ironic? That,
Yeah. It's crazy.
it's like I see life cycles. Like if you're around long enough, you'll always see life cycles. And it's like anything in the space, things come and go. High volume, low carbs, low fat, low whatever, fucking whatever.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. But the hustle culture thing was like super hard. And then it softened a little bit. Then it softened way too much. And now, I think now what we're seeing is we're starting to move out of that and we're starting to tell people that you need to not focus on things too much, right? We're finding like a middle ground.
Middle ground.
Yeah. And the whole reason I'm saying that is because, again, these issues lend themselves to certain personality types and stuff. So if you are someone that's struggling with something like inflammatory bowel disease or an autoimmune issue, which can be kind of hard to figure out at first,
Yep.
I think that my advice initially would be to start with quantifiable variables as much as you can, right?
Yep.
Training is going to be one of those. And then start getting into the stuff that's a little more obscure. And you might need help,
Yeah.
but you're going to have to be open to it. That's
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. If you're not open to it or you can't take any type of constructive feedback without feeling like you're being targeted or something,
Yeah.
you're going to have a hard time.
I think one of the biggest things is about kind of a reporting stuff and logging stuff down, but not fixating on it, as you say, because I think that creates more of a problem for most people. But at the same time, I think you need to have an honest conversation with yourself at times to pull yourself back, because I know certainly when I was going through my big flares, I was maybe still running to the toilet even when I was in the gym, but I was still pushing myself in the gym, and there was no thought back then about me reducing volume, reducing intensity. Everything was still the same.
Yeah.
Whereas now I look back on that, and that was one of my probably biggest problems. But also, as you mentioned about like sleep and stuff like that, that was also one of my biggest problems, because I worked night shifts. I was lucky if I slept 4 hours, 5 hours. And again, it was just cumulative stress outside. And then the training aspect of it was just making things worse. And it wasn't until I started realising all that and pulling things back, and as you say, started tracking stuff that was measurable and what was going to actually step me forward, that's when I started to see progress with things starting to calm down.
Did you find at the initial part of the tracking process that you were like reaching for a lot of stuff to try to track?
Yeah, because I think even though I knew what I was doing to an extent, I think everybody goes down the general route, so you listen to everybody else, so you're generalising everything, so
Social
you're tracking
media.
Yeah, so you're tracking everything until you start to realise, like, that's not really doing anything for me, and I probably don't really need to bother with that. But this here is where I'm starting to feel or notice things, so let's follow that route. And I think just listening and learning your own body. And again, but that's easy for maybe me to say or you to say. Some people can't do that yet. And I think that's where the coaching's valuable. But again, not everybody can afford a coach. So the biggest advice there is, is about listening, and as I said, you kind of writing stuff down but not fixating on it, because it's data, but you don't need too much data. But everybody needs different data because it depends on what you're trying to do.
There's a couple like sayings. One is stepping over dollars to pick up pennies.
Yeah.
Right? Or minoring or majoring in the minors.
Yep.
Right? Which, we're really what you're talking about is like putting a lot of emphasis on very small things that don't move the needle very much.
Yeah.
Right? The big things that move the needle are always going to be the foundational items, which your training, your sleep, your nutrition. Okay.
Yep.
So when you're talking about like tracking variables, it's extremely easy to get sucked into down that rabbit hole or the black hole of variable tracking and symptom tracking, because there's so many ways you can do it now. You can wear things on your body that do it for you, but I think that it's like, well, what do you do with it when you have it? Right? Like, what is that? Like, what are you actually going to do with that data?
Yeah.
Right. And I posted a quote, might have been yesterday or the day before. It was something to the degree of choosing the strategy is not hard. It's sticking with the strategy long enough to see it work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
It is, because ultimately, if I took, and I can tell you this, if I took someone that has something like IBD, Crohn's, colitis, anything, I've worked with a lot of them, and some present symptoms a lot worse than others. Maybe it's because they're like in an active flare up or something. So I have a guy right now has colitis, Crohn's. It's one or the other. I would remember off the top of my head, but he had a very stressful job, and we talked about basically his recovery capacity because of his job and trying to implement training with it and all these other things. And the job was taking a large psychological toll. So long story short, he doesn't have that job anymore. Now, that's not a possibility for everyone. So like, I'm not saying that everyone can just quit their job, although it would solve a lot of problems, except you probably wouldn't have anywhere to live.
Yeah.
That would be, new problems. But ironically or unironically, most of his symptoms went away.
Yeah.
And so, so that was a case where it was like not quantifiable. It was a psychological stressor that was, driving it. It's just, but we see these instances all the time. I mean, see instances of people going on vacation and having symptom reduction, even though they're eating off their plan. We more symptoms during the week when they're working and less symptoms on the weekend when they're off work or whatever. Like, there's any million number of patterns. Even the one, like, I know you and I had talked about, like, someone had told me they drank alcohol and they had less GI symptoms. I'm like, well, yeah, because you were a little bit tipsy and you weren't stressed.
Yeah.
Like, trust me, there was nothing mechanistically with the alcohol itself that was like healing you. Certainly not, and definitely not that quickly. So I think that the hardest part is that people are just so used to feeling a certain way, they can't even imagine themselves feeling any different. And so it's very hard, I think, to think, well, if I reduce my training, that'll help. How do you even wrap your head around that when you're like, this is just how I am, this is just how I feel? It's kind of like you just have to have faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the hardest things on that is, just say you're training so many days a week and you're not seeing improvements. Again, it's just back to that old, people think they need to do more rather than less, and that's where the kind of a combat comes to try and reduce it. But I mean, even when you look at like social media and in terms of like people swapping coaches, whether it's bodybuilding or even lifestyle people, you know, who kind of swap about coaches, they might go to another coach and they have a different approach to training. And a lot of the times you see and hear that when they reduce the volume, obviously I'm not privy to whether they were against it or not, but generally they follow it because it's the new coach. But then you see them kind of explode in terms of, you know, their mindset or kind of a muscle mass or their physique, all just because they reduced the training and they've reduced the overall stress because, you know, going to somebody else and speaking to them has given them a different perspective from what they were doing.
And then the new coach is a hero and the old coach is a zero, because when in reality they just bought into the new coach more.
Yeah.
Probably. Right? The old
Yep.
coach might have actually had a decent strategy. And one of the questions I ask in my questionnaire is, this is going to be a giveaway. If anyone inquires, they're going to know now, but is, have you had any negative past coaching experiences? And it on paper, it sounds like I'm asking, I want dirt on some coaches, but I don't care actually at all. Really what that question tells me is two things. One is, I don't want to make the same mistakes, right?
Yep.
I could learn something there perhaps. Two is that if they tell me that they have had 6 coaches in the past 2 years and they all were terrible, that might say something about the client.
Yeah.
There's a lot of coaching that's not good. I mean, don't get me wrong, I suppose it's possible for that to happen. It probably tells me that they have a coachability issue, a trust issue or something like that. And then I can read the rest of the consult and talk to them, and I can usually tell pretty quickly that they're like big wall. They don't, they're not really open to trying different things. They're not open to reducing volume. They're not open to changing movement selection. I want to feel better while just doing the same things that I'm doing, essentially. Or what people will do is they'll just keep jumping until they finally find someone that confirms their bias, right? Yeah. They'll jump and jump and jump until they just find the person that basically already aligns with what they want to do, or just tells them whatever they want to hear because they take their money.
Yeah.
And, that's how it is.
Yeah, it's funny. One of your points there, I actually made a post recently. I can't remember if it was today or yesterday, and it's about, a lot of people that would maybe come tell me what they can't do, but they're not telling me what they can do because they're so fixated on right now what they can't do, instead of actually saying, right, but what can you do, or what are you willing to try? Because they're very different things, and I think people fixate too much on what they can't do, whether they physically can't do it or whether they just mentally can't do it, because in their head there's that wall there and they're not willing to try. And that's, I think, sometimes where, again, just back down to the kind of a psychological side of it and trying to speak to the person, because that's where we need to kind of hammer that wall down to try and get them in progress.
Yeah, I love that point too. It's especially if you're getting a lot of, and we can use training as an example, especially if you're getting a lot of pushback, and I might just say, well, what will you do?
Yeah.
Let's start there. What are you willing to do here? And, or what do you think we should do?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that that's a very valid point, and there has to be some willingness. It's that choose your hard, right? It's going to be hard. Well, having IBD is hard. Having to do things that make you uncomfortable or unfamiliar are also hard, but at least one of them is going to lead to something positive, right?
Again, I think you just need to go through some of the hard stuff. I don't think there's a way when you've got autoimmune, you're going to go through some hard stuff, whether that's, gut protocols, training. You know, you're going to go through some hard shit, and I think you just need to really be happy with that and kind of look to go on with it.
Well, maybe just change the perspective a little bit towards it, because the perspective is that it's difficult, which is maybe that's a negative, but the difficulty means you're about to break through to something better, right? Like there's not a whole lot of things that are really going to take you to like a new level or break through some kind of plateau or something like that are easy. Probably not, right? But it'll be really nice when you do. You know, but that applies to everything. You know, that's life. That's really anything. And even if you've done something a really long time, there may still be instances where you have to do that, right? If you want to go any further. But on the other hand, if you don't want to go further, that's okay. That's okay. I am not going to be upset if someone says, hey, I just would prefer to have bloody stools the rest of my life. And I'm like, cool. Have at it.
I tell you, I know I certainly don't want that. I'll go through anything rather than that.
I don't think anyone's going to say that, but that's kind of what it's kind of like. What are your options? You could just, I mean, that's really where you're at. And then obviously then you're risking other potential issues down the line that could be even more severe. But you know, it's not, it won't hurt my feelings if you don't, but just understand that, you know, you're not going to get anywhere. So this temporary discomfort, you know, is going to be worth it.
Yep, for sure.
So, yeah, that was, I mean, I think that pretty much sums up training for the most part, as far as how you're programming. I mean, of course, the amounts are going to be largely based on the individual. But if you kind of remember what we talked about at the beginning, it is, here's your baseline. It's a reduction from your current baseline.
Yep.
For most people, right? Unless you're obviously new, and that's a little bit different. But yeah, Sean and I are not going to sit here and say like you need to do 3 sets or 1 set or, you know, 27 sets. I guess it depends on what you're doing currently.
Yeah, there's so many variables in there to give any sort of specifics. But listen, Austin, thanks very much for coming on, especially for the first episode. Couldn't think of any better guest. But do you want to do your plug, let people know where they can find you, and maybe mention the mentorship if any coaches of that are listening as well? Yeah,
absolutely. So probably the easiest place is just on Instagram. You can find me at Austin ST and the number 8 on Instagram. If you go to my bio, there's a link for inquiries. There's a link for like a link tree if you want to go to any of the other platforms or check out. I have classes and stuff in a marketplace that you guys can purchase if you're interested in things like digestion and hormones. Any inquiries, I mean, it's all right. Just go to the bio. It's all right there. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, listen, Austin, thanks very much for coming on, as I said. Pleasure having you, and I hope to have you back on and we can go over maybe some other topics, whether it's nutrition or maybe even some blood work. Yeah, absolutely. There's, I'm sure, plenty we can talk about. I appreciate it. Excellent. Well, thanks very much, and this has been the first episode of the Functional Health Podcast. We'll see you next time.